I believe in getting started promptly at the right time, so I am very happy to introduce President John Nunes of Concordia.
Thank you. Thank you. What a joy to be together again with neighbors and friends of the Bronxville Public Library. Some of you may have been present in 2011 when we joined with you and Amy Chua, and she talked about her book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. And a few months later when we hosted Robert Massey, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman. Both events were like this, packed houses. Concordia College is exceedingly grateful for community partnerships like these. Being a part of this community is essential to our identity. In fact, if you'll bear with me, I'd like to read a little portion of our mission statement, which speaks to this. As an academic community, we embrace hospitality, civility, and respectful dialogue across differences. As an academic institution, we are committed to intellectual rigor, as well as co-curricular and pedagogical experiences that are personalized, enduring, and actionable. Tonight promises to be one such event. I will now turn over to Margaret Major, President of the Friends of the Bronxville Public Library, who will introduce tonight's special guests. Thank you and welcome.
Hi, good evening. I'm Margaret Major, and I am the president of the Friends of the Bronxville Public Library, and I'd like to join President Nunes in welcoming you tonight to our author talk with Min Jin Lee, the author of Pachinko. We're delighted and excited to have Min Jin here with us. You'll hear more about her story as the evening unfolds, but suffice it to say, it took her 20 years to write and publish Pachinko, and I know many of you in the audience have read it, and it was clearly a heartfelt endeavor and one that produced a wonderful book that I certainly enjoyed a great deal. By the end of it, I felt like Sanja and Hansu and Isak and Noah and Mazasu and Solomon were family members, and I wanted to know even more about their story and their future, but we'll hear more from Min Jin about these characters and how she came to create them. Min Jin is going to be interviewed tonight by Sissel McCarthy, who is a Bronxville resident, one of our own. She moved here from Atlanta 4 years ago, and she's the mother of 4 boys. She's also the director of the journalism program at Hunter College and a former anchor at CNN and CNBC. And so I'd like to ask them to come out onto the stage. And while they make their way out here, I would like to say thank you to all my fellow board members at the library, as well as the Board of Trustees at the Bronxville Library. We love our library. And we have many of our friends and donors here tonight. Thank you all for supporting us, and I hope you'll continue to do so. Those of you who are not donors, there's a big silver bowl out there on the table. Please feel free to throw in, 5s, 10s, 100s. We'll put it to good use. There's also some pens and paper you can write your name down, and we'll make sure to acknowledge any gifts that you provide. There's some envelopes too. So thank you to all of you for that. And thank you, President Nunes, again. I'd also like to thank Joyce Kennedy, who's the Director of Community Outreach. None of us can get by without our friends, and we value the friendship with Concordia very, very much. So thank you, Joyce, for inviting us to host this author talk here at Concordia. We really appreciate everything you've done to make this happen. We'd also like to thank Steve, the head of security, and his team who's out there in the rain directing people. Can't say thank you enough to them, and also to Ro for all of the, he's back there in the booth waving, all of the IT and AV support, and Peter North too. So thank you, everyone. Oh, wait a second, Irina Stern. we have to thank Irina Stern for bringing Min Jin to Bronxville, and it's through her Korean connections that we are able to enjoy such a lovely evening tonight. So thank you so much, Irina.
Well, good evening, and welcome to this conversation with Min Jin Lee. You are in for a real treat tonight. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Min, and I'd like to start off with an introduction and share some of what I've learned so you can get to know her a little bit better as well tonight. After that, Min will read a passage from Pachinko, and she and I will talk about the book for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to you. So get your questions ready. We'll take questions from the audience, and then at 8 o'clock, we'll wrap up, and Min will sign copies of her books in the lobby and continue the conversation there. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Min Jin Lee. Min was born in South Korea and moved to Elmhurst, Queens when she was 7.5 years old. Initially, her father operated a news kiosk, and then he started a wholesale jewelry business. She has 2 sisters and can understand Korean, but never went to Korean school to learn how to read or write it well. She attended Yale University and then Georgetown Law School, after which she practiced corporate law until 1995 when she decided she wanted to become a writer. Now, that didn't go so well at first. She wrote 2 books that didn't get published. But her third attempt, titled Free Food for Millionaires, about Korean Americans living in New York, received universal acclaim in 2007. It was then that she returned to her abandoned second novel about the Korean diaspora in Japan. She had started this book in 1989 after hearing a Protestant missionary speak at Yale about a middle school boy who was teased so mercilessly because he was Korean that he committed suicide, a true story that haunted her for years to come and actually did make it into Pachinko. So when she, her husband, and her son moved to Japan in 2007, she decided to expand the scope of the original story, which had taken place only during the 1980s in Japan. Expand it she did by interviewing countless zainichi. Now that's the Japanese word for ethnic Koreans living in Japan. She spoke with everyone from business people to Korean hostesses to Pachinko parlor owners. Their accounts made her realize that she needed to tell a much bigger story. In fact, the only chapter that survived from her first version was the one about Solomon working for the British Investment Bank. But in its place came a stunning novel that deftly chronicles the injustices and suffering of Koreans living in Japan, but also their resilience, their hope, and their grace. As reviewer Adam Morgan wrote early last year, reading Pachinko is like binge watching an entire HBO series. Instead of capturing a single time and place, Min Jin Lee's heartbreaking historical novel spans the entire 20th century through 4 generations, 3 wars, and 2 countries with a troubled past. A moving and powerful account of one of the world's most persecuted immigrant communities, Koreans living in Japan. It may be remembered as one of the best books of the year. Well, in fact, Pachinko went on to become a national bestseller, a New York Times Editor's Choice, a finalist for the National Book Award, and one of New York Times' top 10 books of 2017. It was a nearly 30-year labor of love from its conception to its debut, and I'm sure I speak for the audience, Min, to say how delighted we are to have you here to share your perspective on Pachinko.
Thank you so much.
So as I mentioned, we're going to start off with Min reading a passage from the book, and she's decided to read a passage near the end of the book where 14-year-old Solomon gets fingerprinted. So before we start, Min, why is this one of the passages that you like to share with audiences?
Oh, first of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming tonight. It's Tuesday night. Do you know that it's Tuesday night? I was so surprised because when Irina contacted me, where are you, Irina? she said, I think maybe 20, 30 people are going to show up. And I said, sure, I'll come. And then all of a sudden the number started to grow. And then she said that I'll be interviewed by Sissel McCarthy. How cool is that? And then most of all, I really just wanted to say that I pretty much can't say no to libraries because I came to America in '76 when I was 7.5. And English is my second language. And I had a very serious speech issue where I didn't know how to talk to people. So I did know how to talk, but I couldn't talk. And I couldn't speak English, so I had all sorts of issues. But because of the kindness of librarians at the Elmhurst Public Library, I did learn how to read and write and eventually learn how to talk. So I do feel it's enormous debt to public libraries. They are one of the greatest treasures. They're really one of the greatest treasures that America offers its new arrivals. So thank you. And I hope that you will support the Bronxville Library generously. Because I'm donating my time today for the library. And I'm happy to do it. I'm really, really honored to do it because I do feel this enormous sense of debt to public libraries in this country. Also, thank you, Sissel, so much for spending time with me today. If you have any idea how much homework she does, you'd be like, oh, that's why she's a professor of journalism.
Thank you.
She does not phone it in. To answer your question, the reason why I wanted to read this section in particular is because I think that in our country we're going through a very particular time. And around the world we're going through a very particular time. According to the UNHCR, there are 65 million refugees in the world that nobody seems to want. 65 million refugees that nobody really wants. And I think that we can think of it in many ways because part of our ancestry, we could probably say, perhaps you come from a refugee that nobody wanted. And that is really very powerful for us to think about, to be on the other side, because we are here, we're in this really lovely room thinking about cool things, and we're with each other and we're safe. And no one can haul us out. But this issue is really important to me, so I'd love to share it with you if I can.
Yes.
I'm going to read about 6.5 minutes, maybe, like F that. I always read short because I want you to like me. I can't stand readers who go on and on. And this section of the book comes toward the latter part of the book, and there's only 3 characters that we need to be mindful of. We have Moses, and Moses is a very wealthy Pachinko parlor owner, and we have his son Solomon, who is a boy, who is a teenage boy. And then we have Etsuko, who is a restaurant owner, and she is Japanese. So we have Moses and Solomon, who are Korean Japanese, and then we have Etsuko, a Japanese restaurant owner. We are not in Bronxville right now. We are not at beautiful Concordia College. We are in Yokohama. It is 1976, and I want you to imagine with me. The Yokohama ward office was a giant gray box with an obscure sign. And the first clerk that they saw was a tall man with a narrow face and a shock of black hair buzzed off at the sides. And he stared at Etsuko shamelessly, his eyes darting across her breasts, her hips, and her jeweled fingers. She was overdressed compared to Moses and Solomon, who wore white dress shirts, dark slacks, and black dress shoes. And they looked like the gentle Mormon missionaries who used to glide through her village on their bicycles when she was a girl. Your name. The clerk squinted at the form that Solomon was filling out. Solomon. What kind of name is that? It's from the Bible. He was a king and the son of David, a man of great wisdom. My great uncle named me. And the boy smiled at the clerk as if he was sharing a secret. He was a very polite boy, but because he had gone to school with Americans and other kinds of foreigners at his international schools, sometimes he said things that a Japanese would never have said. Solomon. King. Great wisdom. Koreans don't have kings anymore. What did you say? Etsuko said. And quickly, Moses pulled her back. And she glanced at Moses. His temper was far worse than hers. Once, when a restaurant guest had tried to make her sit with him, Moses, who happened to be there that night, walked over, picked him up bodily, and threw him outside the restaurant, breaking the man's ribs. And she was expecting no less of a reaction now. But Moses averted his eyes from the clerk, and he stared at Solomon's right hand. And he smiled. "Excuse me, sir. We're in a hurry to return home because it's the boy's birthday. Is there anything else that we should do?" "Thank you very much for understanding." And confused, Solomon turned to Etsuko, and she flashed him a warning look. And the clerk pointed to the back of the room and told Moses and Etsuko to sit down. And Solomon remained standing opposite the clerk. And in a long rectangular room shaped like a train car, with bank teller windows running parallel alongside opposite walls, half a dozen people sat on benches reading their newspapers or manga, and Etsuko wondered if they were all Korean. And Moses sat down, and then he got up again, and he asked her if she wanted a can of tea from the vending machine. And she nodded, yes. She felt like slapping the clerk's face. In middle school, she had once slapped a gossipy girl, and it had been very satisfying. And when Moses returned with their tea, she thanked him. "You must have known. You must have warned him, ne?" And after the words came out, they sounded harsh, and she felt sorry. "No. I didn't say anything to him." And he opened and he closed his fists rhythmically. "I came here with my mother and brother Noah for my first registration papers. And the clerk was normal. Nice even. So I asked you to come. I thought maybe having a woman, a Japanese woman, might help. It was stupid. It was stupid to wish for kindness." "Oh, no, no. You couldn't have warned him. I shouldn't have said it like that." "It is hopeless. I cannot change his fate. He is Korean. He has to get those papers, and he has to follow all the steps of the law perfectly. Once, at a ward's office, a clerk told me that I was a guest in his country. But you and Solomon were born here." "Yes. My brother Noah was born here too." And Moses covered his face with his hands. Anyway, the clerk wasn't wrong. And this is something that Solomon must understand. We can be deported. We have no motherland. And life is full of things that he cannot control. So, he must adapt. My boy has to survive. And Solomon returned to them. And next he had his photograph taken, and afterward he had to go to another room to get fingerprinted. And then they can go home. And the last clerk was a very pretty woman with a long ponytail. And she took Solomon's left index finger and gently depressed it into a pot filled with thick black ink. And Solomon depressed his finger onto a white card as if he was a child painting. And Moses looked away, and he sighed. And the clerk told him to go pick up the registration card in the next room. "Let's go get your dog tags," Moses said. Solomon looked at his father. It's what we dogs must have. And the clerk looked furious suddenly. The fingerprints and the registration cards are vitally important for government records. There's no need to feel insulted by this. It is an immigration regulation required for foreign. And Etsko stepped forward. But you don't make your children get fingerprinted on their birthday. And the clerk's neck turned red. My son is dead. And Etsko bit her lip. She didn't want to feel anything for this woman, but she knew what it was like to lose your children. It was like you were cursed, and nothing would ever restore the desolation of your life. Koreans do a lot of good for this country, Etsko said. They do the difficult jobs the Japanese don't want to do. They pay taxes, they obey laws, they raise good families, and they create jobs. You Koreans always tell me this. And Solomon blurted out, she's not Korean. And Etsko touched his arm, and the three of them walked out of the building. She wanted to crawl out of the gray box and see the light of outdoors again. She longed for the white mountains of Hokkaido. And though she had never done so in her childhood, she wanted to walk in the cold, snowy forests, beneath the flanks of dark, leafless trees. In life, there was so much insult and injury, and she had no choice but to collect what was hers. But now, she wished to take Solomon's shame and add it to her pile, although she was already so overwhelmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Min. That was a wonderful reading and a very powerful scene because I think it tells the universal story of immigrants and the humiliation and prejudice they face regardless of the country. There are passages with Sunja and her family are living in squalor and treated as if they were dogs. It's very painful to read, yet sadly familiar. So I was wondering what attracted you to that theme and if there was anything personal since you yourself were an immigrant.
You know, it's very funny. People have asked me this a lot, and they've said, why have you worked on this book for such a long time? What is wrong with you? And they're not totally wrong. Like, I think I had all these incredible doubts throughout this entire process of writing it because I got the idea in 1989. I started the whole book in 96. I finished an entire manuscript in 2003, but it was terrible, so I had to start all over again when I went to Japan. So, in short, people have asked me, why do you do this? Why have you done this? Are you insane? Do you come from a lot of money? And the answer is no, actually. So I did it because I was not treated this way. I really wasn't. I think that in many ways I had this very sort of charmed existence in Elmhurst, Queens, where people were so incredibly kind to me from all different backgrounds. So I had Jewish high school teachers who wrote my college recommendations. I had Puerto Rican English teachers who taught me how to write better sentences. I had African American professors throughout my life who really encouraged me. And I think when you grow up in New York, you're very lucky because you get to have this sort of microcosm of this incredible ethnic diversity, not just racial diversity. So I remember when I went to Yale, I didn't know what white people were. Because like I knew people who are Polish or Italian or Jewish or Italian. Like people just were different, you know. And so I went to Yale and people were like, "There's white and there's black," and I was like, "What does that mean?" So I think that I felt a sense of indignation when I heard this story because I knew that's not the way it has to be. And I think in that sense, it's not that I think American history is perfect. That's not it at all. I could tell you all the federal laws backwards and forwards of what have been some of the tragic moments in American history, but what is really important about America is that one, we can talk about it, and then two, we have to be honest about it, and then three, I think that in certain places, people are incredibly open to the myth and narrative of diversity in this country.
And people can make their home, and you play a lot with the definition of home and what home means. And Sunja and her children were, in effect, nationless. And
That's the language they often use when I interview them. They usually say, I do feel stateless. They said this so repeatedly.
Yeah, in
all
fact,
my
Moses
interviews.
says, in Seoul, people like me get called Japanese bastard, and in Japan, I'm just another dirty Korean, no matter how much money I make or how nice I am.
And that was really quite stunning because I did think that I identified with them as Korean, like in the same way I could identify with you as an American. And they were really surprised because when they had gone back to South Korea thinking that they would find a sort of home connection, very often they were insulted.
Yes.
And they were just heartbroken because they had this sort of beautiful romantic idea. Many of them love coming to America because then they can have a sense of privacy about who they are without feeling ashamed.
And in fact, there are still 850,000 ethnic Koreans living in Japan, and they didn't stop the fingerprinting until 1993.
That's right.
So quite recently. Let's talk about the title. So Pachinko is a national pastime in Japan, in case you were wondering. It's a game of chance, but I'm also told requires some skill and some luck. Well, it certainly could be a metaphor for Sunja and her family's life, because it seemed like someone was always adjusting the pins so things wouldn't quite work out for her, just like Goro-san had taught Moses to do.
Yeah, Pachinko is a $203 billion business. So $203 billion, if you can kind of wrap your mind around all those zeros, it's twice the export revenues of the Japanese auto industry. So if you drive a Japanese car, and you know that they make very wonderful cars, twice the export revenue. So it's not like the way you and I think about Las Vegas. It's about the way, it's a cornerstone of the Japanese economy. It's a really important cornerstone. However, this business is dominated by the Korean Japanese, and it's also seen as a very low-class thing to do. And the people who are involved in it are considered not just low-class, but they're considered criminal, they're considered immoral, and very often, as with any hated group, they're often seen as unhygienic, which I thought was really interesting, because I always think of Koreans as being very clean people, but apparently but then again, if you look at any of the racist tracts in America or anywhere else, people often say, oh, they're dirty, they have bad habits, and they carry disease. So that's one of the things, but the reason why that the hygienic stuff comes up is because the Koreans were often forced to live in these kind of ghettos in Japan when they first arrived, and even now, many of them can't rent apartments. They usually have to buy something because they can't become tenants.
Yeah. But what about it as a metaphor? So Moses, you write in the book, Moses' Presbyterian minister, Isaac, father, had believed in a divine design, and Moses believed life was like this game where the player could adjust the dials, yet also expect the uncertainty of factors he could not control. He understood why customers wanted to play something that looked fixed, but which also left room for randomness and hope. And in fact, I read that you're a Presbyterian, and this does sound a little familiar to the Presbyterian belief in fate and predestination at the same time.
Yeah, I think predestination is such a funny concept, and it's something that I believe in. I think of it as to have two sort of opposing ideas or contrary ideas.
Yeah.
So I think of it as an analogy of like the light. Light is a particle and a wave. That idea kind of like blew all of our minds when we thought about it, but I think predestination says there is a destiny and there is free will, and it's something that you have to constantly toggle together and try to understand where is your position in this, and this idea that you have to choose God. It's interesting to talk about it in this room right now. I hope I don't mess up because I know smarter people than me have talked about this issue. But I was interested in this idea of what happens when you feel like fate is failing you? What happens when you feel like history doesn't make any sense? What do you do? And I had never met people like this before. I had never studied a population like this before in such an advanced economy, in such an incredibly civilized nation, to have this group that doesn't make any sense. And yet they really wanted to stay there. They didn't feel like they could go back, and they were trying to adapt and deal with the bad hand that they were dealt.
In fact, your opening line is, history has failed us, but no matter, which really sets the stage for suffering. You know, despite the odds against Sunja and all the women in the book, they are so strong, so resilient, they never give up. You write, they're suffering and more suffering, and no matter how hard they work, they should expect suffering and just keep working hard.
It's a really happy book.
But Sunja and most of the women, the female characters, are like this. In fact, the whole novel really feels like a tribute to women?
You know, it's a tribute to people who are illiterate and poor and people who never get their due and working class people, middle class people who have no voices. What really sort of strikes me about suffering is that it's actually so commonplace, but we're not allowed to talk about it. And in America, this nation that I feel so deeply connected to, and I feel like, well, I am an American citizen legally, but I also feel very spiritually very akin to being an American because I'm very optimistic. But one of the things that I don't like about the popular culture of America is this pursuit of this constant expectation of happiness, this constant pursuit of happiness. And I almost feel like it's making people so miserable. And I almost wish that if we could just sort of admit that things are kind of difficult, and once in a while things are going to be really cool, and other times it's going to be really shitty, then at least we can sort of accept the terms. And one of the privileges that, you know, as a journalist you must understand very well is that, like, I've interviewed so many people, and I'm so amazed at how many people who look perfect are suffering so profoundly. And they can't talk about it because people think, oh, because I make a lot of money or I have a beautiful home or because whatever, but then you hear that their kid is sick or they have cancer or they just got laid off and they have a ton of debt or something. And there's like all this stuff going on, all the shame because things are supposed to be perfect all the time and happy all the time. And my first book is taught at Columbia, and every year the professors bring me in and ask me to say, please tell the children about your beliefs about happiness. And I think to myself, these children are going to hate me in about 5 minutes. And I always say that I don't believe in the pursuit of happiness. And their faces like totally fall. And I always say, I believe that you should do good. You should lead lives of purpose. That you should try to be decent even when it's really difficult. And you will find joy. And they always look at me like, did my mom call you? I mean, like, but I do think this whole thing of like, he's got to make you happy or you've got to be happy all the time. This level of depression in this country, I almost feel like part of it's definitely chemical, but part of it's also because people feel embarrassed about how unhappy they are. But sometimes there is a reason to feel grief. There's a reason to lament. And I think there is a season of that in your life, in your day, and I want to honor that in people's lives.
And it's definitely a theme in the book, and identity is a huge question, particularly with Noah and his relationship with Akiko, the super smart, stunning Japanese girl from Waseda University, who was so critical to the narrative, of course, because she revealed the obvious to Noah. But what I found actually even more interesting is the other truths she revealed to him when she asked him if he was embarrassed to be Korean. And Noah suddenly realized, this was an important moment for him in the book.
Yeah, this is the reveal, and it's not too much of a spoiler because the reader always knows that Noah is obviously ethnically Korean, and it's revealed to him later on. And the Ring of Truth confirms this. And I always feel so bad for people who have this issue because like they're really embarrassed, and I always feel like it's not your fault. We didn't make the announcement. I think that it really struck me when I interviewed all these Korean Japanese, how many of them had someone in their family who was passing for Japanese. So it's sort of unusual, like when we think about, let's say, Madeleine Albright and her parents, or like Ian Buruma and his grandparents, and we had people who sort of were passing, or we have the whole history of African Americans who were light enough to pass when they had the Great Migration. So we understand that we have this thing, but it seems like almost like a one-off incident. But when I interviewed the Koreans in Japan, almost everyone had someone in their family or someone that they knew who was pretending to be Japanese. And that was quite stunning because it was like, so for example, if Sissel and I were sisters and I was passing and she saw me on the street, she would have to deny me. Otherwise she would blow my cover. And I can't even imagine what that must be like to be sisters.
To carry that around.
Carry that around. And then you might miss your sister, even though you might like your life where you don't have the complications of being Korean. And that level of sacrifice as well as self-abnegation, I do think is so toxic and sad.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a passage where you write, Noah didn't care about being Korean when he was with her. In fact, he didn't care about being Korean or Japanese with anyone. He just wanted to be himself, and of course, that's the one thing he couldn't be.
Yeah, I think about that a lot because, I mean, and think of a theological word, ontological, when we really want to be just known for ourselves, essentially of who we are. And of course, it seems like such a romantic idea, but eventually all of us really want to be known for the essence of who we are and to be accepted unconditionally. Of course, none of us offer this to other people, but we want it. And I think it's something that's really primitive and natural, yet it's a hunger that doesn't get met.
And that was the root of a lot of his shame, the importance of family honor and guilt, also recurring themes in the story. And this somehow seems cultural. In our book club, you know, we talked about that it seems like that was much more important than it would be maybe in an American, you know, a story, immigrant story.
You mean about shame?
Yeah,
or?
the shame and family honor and the guilt they felt, perhaps about shaming the family.
Yeah, well, it's funny about shame in America because I think we all suffer shame. So the way I understand shame versus guilt is if you do something wrong and you feel bad about it, so there's a reason. But shame is when you think there's something wrong with you. That's really difficult to fix. And I think that it's really incredible if you think that you're ashamed of how you were born, because that's not going to change. I mean, you can change it. Like maybe there's certain features that you could change. Like maybe I could change my hair color, or maybe I could wear different kinds of shoes, like appearances. But if you have certain immutable characteristics that you cannot
like
change,
being born Korean.
like being born Korean, or let's say you have an illness that you can't change. These immutable characteristics, and to take that on and to feel bad about it, and to have another culture outside of you in the social norm that says, you're right, you should feel bad about who you are. That's incredible to think that compounding whatever bad, bad feelings you had, and then to make it even more amplified. So that was really striking to me, because I saw it so much. And also, if you're a kid, you can't fight back. You don't have the language to say, I disagree. Like, I had a lot of things wrong with me as a kid, like so many things. And I didn't know because I was so off that I didn't even know there was something wrong with me. It's kind of funny now, but I had this kind of intense social awkwardness and I couldn't really speak to people. But there are many people around me who, I guess, try to pretend like that didn't happen. And they were so nice about it that I really didn't know there was something wrong.
You weren't self-conscious about it.
I wasn't self-conscious about it. And then now I look back and go, why wasn't I invited to a birthday party ever? And I only started to realize a lot of these things when I had a child of my own, and I compared my childhood versus my son's. And I thought Sam had this great childhood, and in many ways he did, but I think it's because when I look back, I think, oh, but you have a winter coat. Like, you have two. Like, isn't that amazing? There are all these things that you have to compare yourself against, but in America, especially where I grew up, I was really protected, even though I had issues, some of which I've outgrown.
All right, before we turn it over to the audience, I have to ask, why don't Sunja and Hansu ever get together? Yes, he took advantage of her, but then he tried to make up for it the whole rest of the novel.
Oh, Hansu's like this really sexy character that I loved writing. And I interviewed a lot of people like Hansu, which was really interesting because they're not necessarily physically appealing, but they have an energy in which you talk to this guy and he can just get it done. And you're like, wow, that's kind of nice, because you might have 4 problems and you want them fixed. And he had that and they all had that kind of ability. However, they're all really scary. Like, you would not want to date them, not really. Because you can't make a mistake. You can't make a mistake, and then they also have certain rules, and if you don't follow certain rules, then you're out.
But they were never meant to be.
No, I don't think they're really meant to be. However, I do think they have, and this is something that I talked about with an anthropologist at length, apparently men, and men here could disagree with me, apparently men cross-culturally have an attachment to the mother of their the mother of their sons. So when you have a first wife, or when you have a wife who bears you a son, there's a kind of attachment that is cross-culturally very specific, and it's a very lasting bond.
And he only had daughters with his other
Right.
wife.
And when I did speak about it with this anthropologist at length, I was really surprised by how regularly I saw that rule being consistent, how this woman became more important than perhaps she needed to, because by some
bore him a
genetic
son.
fluke, her uterus, yielded a boy.
All right, let's turn it over to the audience. We have student volunteers from Concordia. So if anyone has a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and the students will bring the mic over to you. Anyone want to ask the first question? Okay, we have one over there.
I came all the way from Harlem. I'm dying to hear.
Can you raise your hand again? Right here in that row right there. Yep. If you could stand up, please. Yep.
Sure. We were just talking about Hansu and how he was sort of, for lack of a better term, attractive, but dangerous, and therefore you wouldn't want to be involved with him. However, the gentleman who worked for him, Kim Chang-ho,
Yes.
He got none of the taint of being associated with him, so much so that Yusuf wanted his, I'm sorry for botching the name, wanted his wife to marry him. So I just was wondering how that character, who was this wonderful, and he did have so many wonderful qualities, but how did he escape that taint? Like Noah didn't. Noah couldn't get over the fact that Hansu was his dad and ruined his life. So it seemed to me that somehow, although working for him, working for the bad guy exclusively, that this guy got away with it somehow and ended up still being a good character. And I was trying to wrap my mind around that, and I was wondering if you could address that a little.
What's your name?
I'm Kim. Nice to meet you. And I think you're amazing.
How lovely you are. Thank you. Thank you, Kim. I love this question that Kim raised because it's really a sophisticated question, and it's very important because I wanted to explain the Yakuza in this book. So the Yakuza is an organized crime families. There are a lot of organized crime families in Japan, and unlike here, they're registered. So in Japan, if you want to know where the Yamaguchi family clan is, you could figure out where they are because there's a building and an address and like corporate officers. And the police know exactly where they are. They pay taxes. So it's really interesting, but that's who they are right now. And just historically, the Yakuza are very mythic figures in Japanese film and art and literature. And the way the Yakuza see themselves is very different from the way the Yakuza are. So it's absolutely true that this organized criminal element, they are very pernicious, they're very dangerous, terrifying, and they do terrible, terrible things. However, they also have a kind of Robin Hood aspect to them. And they would all believe that they're in this kind of brotherhood, this fraternity of people who kind of step in when the people in charge don't know what they're doing. So if you have an earthquake in Japan, or if you have a crisis like the Tohoku earthquake and you had the tsunami and you had the nuclear reactors, the people who were there first with blankets and water, not the Red Cross, it was the Yakuza. I know, isn't that weird? It's so interesting, right? Because they're very nimble. They could organize and they can facilitate and they can just sort of show up. So that happens. And then I also wanted to talk about this idea of having impure blood is something that all of us probably feel incredibly uncomfortable with because it reminds us of very terrible moments of atrocities and genocides around the world based on blood, and we should feel really quite horrified by it. However, in Japan and in many other countries around the world, blood is the standard of citizenship, not birth. So the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, they're very exceptions to the rule. Most of the other places in the world, it's based on blood and how that's noted. And the idea of Yakuza blood, why it affects Noah so profoundly to have this dirty blood is because everybody else cares about it so much in Japan. And Noah wanted to do everything right. He wanted to be perfect in many ways. And that kind of ambition, that kind of clarity, and that kind of binary focus of good and evil, that's probably the most immature part of Noah's characterization. And as for Kim Jong-ho, I think he was just an adaptive person. He felt like he was a chosen person by Hansu, a kind of adoptive son. So Hansu really has two sons, Kim Jong-ho, and biologically he has Noah, and one chooses him and one doesn't, but eventually Jong-ho goes to North Korea, and that's not much of a spoiler. And that tract is about two sons who leave him. But the Yakuza is really complicated because it has this very diverse population, and it's seen in a different way than the way we understand criminals in America.
Another question? Jan?
You've just started to touch on this, but I am wondering about Noah's cruelty to Sunja after he finds out about his identity. And maybe it has to do with that sort of focus and precision that he led his life with, but I still didn't understand it. And then if you could also talk about his choice of suicide.
Oh, spoiler alert.
I am so sorry.
Instead of talking about suicide, I think I'd love to talk about death. I know. Happy Tuesday. First suffering, now death. I want to talk about literary death. And I read a wonderful essay by Elaine Showalter at the very end of the Norton collected version, the Norton edited version of A House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. So I don't know if you guys like that book. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And Elaine Showalter argues that when Lily Bart dies, the reason why she has to die is because for a Künstlerroman is a kind of novel, it's a coming-of-age novel of an artist. In order for that work to succeed, Edith Wharton had to kill Lily in order for her to become a mature artist, and then to also elevate the working factory girl. So that's what happens at the end of the book for House of Mirth. I think most of you guys know this story, so I don't think it's a spoiler. And when I read that by Elaine Showalter, it sort of changed my life because I thought a lot about death in a book. Because the choice to give a character birth and to make a character die is probably the toughest choice that the author has to make, and it can't be made in a careless way. I think the reader will not forgive you. And the reader should not forgive you. There has to be a reason why a person has to die. And when I thought a lot about that, one of the things that I am arguing, and to speak sort of obliquely about the question that you raised, is to think about what does it mean to live your life when you pretend that you're somebody else? Isn't that a kind of death anyway? Isn't that a kind of self-mortification? So you have the metaphorical thing that what we do is when we deny who we are, but we also have the literal thing that we do when we actually die. So eventually you have the collision of the metaphor and you also have the literal event occurring. And in terms of the cruelty of Noah, people don't like to think about Noah being cruel, but I think that Noah was incredibly cruel to his mother. I was so struck by, and you may wonder, like, how could she be struck? It's her character. But I think one of the things that I always surprised by is that I have all these characters and I also have these stories, but when I put the characters together, their truth becomes very clear only in action. So I actually have to write it out. So I can say, oh, this is going to happen, but then the truth of a scene becomes very clear. So like if, Jan, you and I, let's say, had a cup of tea, and you said, I'm going to go to the Yankees game, and I say, well, I really like the Mets, and let's say we have a conflict about the baseball game. I could say we're going to resolve it, but let's say you raise the stakes and say, Yankees or death, you know? So you don't know how characters will behave, and in a way, I try really hard to honor the truth of a scene, so not to over-determine it. So I have outlines, I have tons and tons of outlines. However, I revise things all the time, so I am really struck. But if you think about Noah, his biological father also has a kind of cruelty. So in that sense, I do think there's something to be said about genetic personality imprinting.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi, I'm one of the counselors at the Bronxville School, and you're just amazing. And the message that you send is very disarming in a very positive and welcoming way. And I have two quick questions. One, I'm wondering, do you have an adolescent version of your book that we could use? And two, we would love to have you at school.
What's your name?
Jim.
I'm Jim Agnello, one of the counselors at the school. And the students are, the very essence of what you're speaking about, adults obviously sometimes feel uncomfortable and don't have a skill set for. And with all the things that are going on the news, social media, the students are in desperate need of what you just presented.
Oh, well, thank you, Jim. That's really kind of you. And you could tell that you're a counselor because I feel better already. So, your therapeutic is working. So to answer your question, this book is taught now at universities. So Pachinko is also taught at Columbia. I know that because I just spoke to a professor there. And there's a symposium at Johns Hopkins where scholars around the world are going to speak about this book. However, it's also taught in senior history classes at St. Anne's in New York. It's taught at Dalton High School in New York. So I know that it is being taught in seminars. I don't know about in terms of an adolescent thing, but there is no younger version of it at the moment. In terms of going to speak at schools, I'm on tour from now until the end of June. And I think I have something every day. It's so funny, and it's. I'd love to visit those schools, though. I was told that Bronxville is exactly 1 square mile. That's incredible. So it's like the most literary community ever, if you think about it. So we should talk, but thank you so much for your questions. And in terms of your concerns as a counselor, I want you to know that I'm a parent. My son is almost 20. He turns 20 on Saturday. And I don't want to say that I'm afraid of technology. I'm really afraid of how it affects all of us. Because the way technology is advancing right now is at this rate in which we as human beings aren't growing at that same rate. So we don't really understand how it's changing our brains. We don't understand how it's affecting our attention span. I'm so frightened for the next generation and what they can create, because things that are difficult take time. It takes great humility to figure out when you're wrong and to start again. And when I meet young people, I'm always trying to explain to them, like, so for example, I have young people coming up to me all the time asking me who my agent is. Who want to be writers. And I always tell them, her name is Suzanne Gluck, and she's at William Morris, and when you have a manuscript, you should send it to her. You have to have a manuscript. But I think it's charming that they kind of think if you have an agent, then you have a book deal, and I'm going, I wish it were so. But all this information is out in the public domain. You can figure out who the important people are, who aren't, and what's interesting to me is that there are 600,000 to 1 million books that are published every year. So clearly people want to write, people want to disseminate ideas, and I want very much for younger people these days to feel connected with different things beyond a very surface way of knowing things. And I'm not anti-social media 100%. Like, as an author, I have to be on things like Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So I am on it, but I don't think I'm using it in the correct way. I use it sort of in a, like, you'll see where I am kind of thing. But it's not that interesting. Like, I don't document my meals. Because my meals are incredibly dull. Like, mostly it's me trying to not eat that donut. That's pretty much my life in Instagram. But going back to your question about technology, I want you to know that I'm in radical alliance with you when you care about our children. I think we all are. And I think that somehow I would like it if we could stop judging parents and really just see how great the burden is nowadays to take care of our children and protect them from the harms that we don't even understand. So I worry a great deal about it because I think we're more vulnerable than we let on. I see kids, especially the thing that I really see with kids around the country, because I speak at universities around the country, is there's an enormous amount of bluster. Like, I'm fine, I'm awesome, I'm really great. But then privately, they're so sensitive. And people are always feeling excluded. And there's no way to escape this sense of exclusion because you see it on social media all the time. Mm-hmm. So everybody who missed this tonight, you could tell, well.
We have a tape of it. I think we have time for one more. Anne, did you want to ask the last question?
Thank you. My name's Anne, and I'm so grateful that you are here. One of my favorite books.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to ask you to just expand on something Sissel mentioned, which is the role of women in the book. And one overarching comment in our book club discussion was that the women were so long suffering and so serious and full of purpose and drive, and yet lived a very, very difficult life, which is true for many characters in the book. But if you could expand on the role of women as differ from some of the men parallel in the book during those time periods, I'd love it.
I love Anne's question. It's really smart. And it's an important question because I'm a feminist and I'm a global feminist. And the reason why I say I'm a global feminist is because I'm really interested in studying gender of men and women. Because if we only focus on women and we don't understand what they go through contextually as the way their men suffer, then I think we're going to really never solve any problems. So I started my first manuscript, believe it or not, with the intention of writing about Solomon. So the entire 1996 to 2003 manuscript was really about Solomon and a little bit about his dad. There was no Sanja. So Sanja came into the book in 2007 and 2008 when I went to Japan and lived there, and I talked to all these Korean Japanese, and I learned that there was always a kind of illiterate matriarch who had done these extraordinary things that are almost like unthinkable for us. So they would live in a room that's the size of this platform, let's say 4 to 6 people, with pigs. With pigs. And your children were always doing terribly in school because they were teased and they didn't have nice clothes, and they're always being considered beneath animals, and they also smelled like animals because the pigs were living in your house. So the children were often going outside and collecting rubbish to feed the pigs, and the mothers were doing things like selling moonshine and getting arrested all the time. So imagine, Anne, you're trying to put food on the table and there's nothing because your husband is working but he can't get regular work, so you're having to step in and you're making moonshine and you're raising pigs and your kids are doing terribly at school. Not a normal day in Bronxville. Right? So, and I was thinking about that, and I thought, how do I put this into the book and understand that this woman who's raising pigs is somehow connected to Solomon, who's working on Wall Street? And that's the reason why I had to write this really long book. But I wanted to talk about gender because I wanted to understand masculinity because it relates to femininity. So I studied with anthropologists and sociologists the idea that cross-culturally men really want to do 2 things. Men want to earn, and men want to protect their families. But if they're an oppressed minority, they cannot do that because their larger structure will not allow them. And it's so important to understand how oppressed minority men are functioning in any country in which they're not wanted or they're being degraded. Because then their women, wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, have to deal with these men. And the other thing that I learned from studying psychology is that in psychology, of the 2 genders, which gender can handle humiliation better? Right. So it's not so much about the women suffering, it's that women are handling these horribly humiliating situations better. The men cannot handle humiliation in the same way. And consequently, and also they're not allowed to handle humiliation in the same way. So then you have all of these constant collisions between expectation of wanting to be a man, but then society doesn't let you be a man. And the women are like, well, I have to be humiliated, and I will raise pigs, I will pick up garbage, I will do these things and make moonshine and get arrested and lie about why you made moonshine, because that was usually the cycle of the first generation Korean women in Japan. They're making bathtub gin, getting arrested, lying about it, going back and saying, I'll never do it again, and having to do it all over again.
To survive.
Right, so selling kimchi in this book, that's like a high class job. I know people are always like, oh my gosh, she sold kimchi. I'm going like, kimchi's better than moonshine and getting arrested. Like I didn't write that part into the book. But in terms of resilience, I think that we're really tough. I don't mean just the Korean Japanese. The more I interview people across culture, I'm so amazed at how we have a mandate to reproduce and to survive. And as a matter of fact, when we don't have the mandate to reproduce and to survive, we start thinking about other things and having bigger, higher order wishes. And when we don't fulfill those higher order wishes, that's when we start to feel really discouraged. So I think in a way, it's interesting to me to study depression statistics across the globe, just to see what happens when you feel a stronger sense to survive. And I was very, very impressed with what these women and men were willing to do. And the men were often not allowed to work. So they would have ordinances in parts of Japan where if you were a day laborer, let's say you're a man and you wanted to work 6 days a week, they would only let you work 3 days a week, which means you couldn't support your family, which meant that your wife had to work, or your girlfriend, or the mother of your children. And these women were doing really embarrassing, difficult, dirty things to survive. But I think that all of you would do it too. I do. The more I meet people, the more I
do what you have to, right?
Yeah, I think you would. So I'm glad you don't have to. I don't want to.
Final question, we're going to wrap up. This is the second in your trilogy about the Korean diaspora. Tell us about what you're working on now, the third book.
Yes. So the diaspora trilogy is called The Koreans. So that's number 2. So the Koreans in Japan. The first one's about Koreans in America. It's Free Food for Millionaires. The third one is about the role and value of education for Koreans around the world. So it's called American Hagwon, and Hagwons exist in Bronxville.
What does that mean, that word?
Hagwon is H-A-G-W-O-N, H-A-G-W-O-N. It's a tutoring center. So if you have any learning centers in Westchester and Bronxville.
Oh, just a few.
Just a few. And they're run by Koreans. It's called a Hagwon, and Korean kids go there. Non-Korean kids go there in this area. So imagine Kumon, but imagine it on speed. Like really intense, very expensive, incredibly time-consuming. And in Korea, children go to Hagwons pretty much the whole afternoon and evening, every day, 6 days a week. So when you're seeing these stunning scores coming out of South Korea in terms of testing, it's not because the kids are smarter genetically, it's because they have 2 schools per day. And I've interviewed now, so I'm writing about the tutors, the parents, the students, all over the world, and I'm trying to ask the metaphysical question, how do you live a wise life?
Well, I'd like to thank Min for sharing her evening with us and sharing this wonderful story in our increasingly polarized country where we're divided by politics and race and religion. It's so wonderful to read a book that transports you to another land, puts you in the shoes of another person, and really reminds us of everything we have in common and our shared humanity. So Min, thank you so much for writing this book. I'd like to thank Irina Choi-Stern again for inviting Min, the Friends of the Bronxville Library, Concordia College, our student volunteers, and of course you, the audience. Thank you for your great questions, and thank you for making time in your life to read books like this. Thank you for coming, and good night.
Thank you.